to see what I said about how this story ends. Huh? Stunned silence. So we're going to talk about rising up this morning. That first Easter, we got to kind of put our heads in the framework of what people were thinking and feeling at that point. It's hard to do on a one-dimensional page, but you've got a group that was grieving. The Jesus movement, there really wasn't anything that we would call Christianity. It didn't exist. It didn't exist for quite a while after that first Easter, actually. It was a movement. It was the Jesus movement within the Jewish community. They called themselves the Way. And that's what they were. They were a way of life. That this movement suddenly was awestruck and on the run. The dark mood of their shattered hopes and dreams burst forth, dashing excitedly and fearfully at the dawn. That's the picture we get in Mark's gospel. It was a hurry and tell them. Did they or didn't they? We don't know in the original ending of Mark. But it's the story of the Jesus who lived is now the Christ who still lives. So every one of these stories from the big moments in our faith, from Jesus' conception to his birth to his being reborn, you get the same angelic visitor with the same message. The message is always, fear not. It's what the supernatural visitor always said to humans. It's not like we're used to being visited by angels. And so it's pretty shocking. Fear not. But the fact is that we are afraid. We're not wired to wrap our heads around something like this. This is not our typical day. It's nobody's typical day. When was the last time you sat over a cup of coffee and someone said, yeah, this angel visited me yesterday? If someone did, you would be dialing the mental health hotline for them, right? Because you'd be worried about their stability. Are they all here? So these stories can be hard for us to really wrap our minds around. Who does this? Who sees these otherworldly encounters? And even in this story, these witnesses provide a first-hand account, but even seeing isn't necessarily believing. Resurrection, the idea of it, is far more complicated than just saying, Christ is risen indeed. It'd be nice. If we put ourselves in the place of the first witnesses, the women at this first Easter, we'd probably be afraid and running too. As we're running, thinking to ourselves, all right, what do I do? Do I just assume it's a bad dream and keep it to myself? Or do I really tell somebody something? The women go out of the tomb on that Easter morning. They go out to that tomb with a collection of sweet-smelling spices. The idea being they were going to go and anoint the body. If you haven't really thought about it before, we're talking about a rock tomb above ground in a desert climate. You can use your imagination as to what that's going to do to the human body after death. And even in a short period of time. So the women were going to anoint the body. They were coming to pay respects, to do what they could to slow down the process of bodily disintegration and decay. That was their job. In effect, to put a better smell on the frightful horror of death. That's what they were doing. But they arrive, and to their amazement, they're told by an otherworldly visitor that Jesus' body is not there anymore, that he's risen. And what does that mean? What does this mean? No one had ever been raised from the dead, bodily raised, and set loose again in the world. What does that mean? He is raised. We just don't have a human experience to relate to that, not directly. Still, the idea of God meets us moments are a lot more frequent than we want to believe. Belief. That's what it really all comes down to, doesn't it? What do we believe? That God lives? All right. Sure. But more important to that, even more important than the idea of whether or not God lives, is the question of, can God live in us? That's more important. God lives is vague. It's out there somewhere. God could live next door, or God could live 2 states across the way. But if you say, God lives in me, God lives in us, that's very personal. That's something you can't necessarily dismiss. I mean, Easter isn't a day, or an hour, or another holiday. Here today, gone tomorrow. Easter's a constant state of mind. At least it's meant to be. Because what this launched was not a season in the lives of these people who were part of the way back then. It launched a movement. It launched a way that never stopped, or we wouldn't be sitting here in 2024 still having this conversation. Still trying to figure out how to make it real. Easter's about all the ordinary days the story doesn't talk about. That's what Easter's really about. It's a kickoff, if you want to put it that way. Initiation. These are moments where we prove whether Christ is risen or is still dead. During the height of the COVID pandemic that we all lived through, many of our friends and family didn't live through, the long church shutdown that happened in just about every place was about as close as most of us will ever get to a literal resurrection experience. I mean, for starters, the church became a tomb. Some of us tried to broadcast from the church, and then when various people helping us with our Sunday ministry came down with COVID, even that didn't fly, and we ended up in, spaces where we could be by ourselves in order to put something online so that people could have some experience. We felt the pull of the grave. The pandemic was one constant Good Friday. 3 days, then 3 weeks, and the days just multiplied, and besides health and incomes being endangered, lives and families got disrupted. Some got even torn apart. And none of us were spared from this. Then, after the danger had passed and vaccinations were more common, churches then reopened. But not everybody came back. Some stayed away because their health made them fear this new unknown enemy. I mean, if you had any kind of a lung ailment or were susceptible to it, you really thought twice and 3 times about whether or not you were going to come back and be around a bunch of people. I mean, others didn't come back because they were simply afraid, period. Still others, in the face of the overwhelming and demanding reality of their lives that got even more demanding and more overwhelming during this period of basic lockdown, people no longer saw the point of going to church. So what does Easter have to say to us about rising up? I mean, every experience of our life should be laid across this idea of who we are as people of faith, and to ask the question, how does we relate? How does it relate to us? What's different about things? How do we see this Jesus, this faith expression operating in our lives? And what questions does it ask us? So what does Easter have to say about that? After a long period of grief and darkness and mourning, our questions are actually the same as our ancestors had on day one. They said, rising to what? Rising to whom? Rising how? This United Church of Christ of ours has blessedly a lot of really incredible people. Most of them ordained, but many not. Tremendous lay people, all of them, in many respects, contribute to our understanding of what it means to be who we are. And there's a whole writers group, and one of the prophets, really, as part of that writers group, is a pastor by the name of Cameron Trimble. And Trimble knows the pandemic was a setback for the church, but maybe not necessarily just in the obvious way. This was just the latest in a decades-long pull toward the tomb that we've all been experiencing in the church. And the pandemic just kind of put the process on speed dial. Trimble tells us the church had, for decades, been living through a transition from organized religion to organizing religion. Long before the pandemic, many congregational leaders were beginning to function more as organizers, directors, if you will. I mean, Jesus taught, and he put his class in session. He was teaching a way of life that could continue, which meant a focus away from the group and out into the broader community that we were all part of. Leaders were beginning to function like that. They were becoming grounded in a living God, Trimble says. Now, when we look at the decline in the, let's just say, the popularity or the purpose or the relevance of our faith tradition, there's plenty of reason for us to go around and go, well, that's at fault, or that person's to blame, or that's lagging, and you could do stuff like that. But the truth is, people today need a lot more than Sunday. A lot more than Sunday. I mean, it's funny that the attitude used to be, if you hire a seminary-trained pastor, the idea was that pastor would be this dynamic presence that would wow a captive audience and pack the pews. And the truth was, most people that came to churches really didn't pay attention to any of that. They came because their friends were there. They came because the boss was there. They came because that's what people did on Sunday, because back in the day, nothing was open, right? I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. You could go to the park. You might be able to hit that drugstore if you really had a need, but that was it. Towns had blue laws, even Wisconsin did, you know. As much as we enjoy our beer, Sunday was hard to get one in some places. And so it was kind of a question of, well, you either stay at home or you go to church. Sadly, that was what a lot of people did. They came because their boss was there. They came because their friends invited them. They enjoyed the people's company. And there was a feel that went along with it. But we need more now today than a Sunday church. We need an everyday experience of what it means to be a part of something that really can provide hope and energy to our lives. To get rid of that whole tomb mentality and to provide something of hope that breaks down and slides away the entrance to all the dark caves of life that we seem to get shoved into. Our fear today, though, is that our life-changing faith tradition, in this case, 185 years of First Congregational Church in Platteville, will somehow die without rising up. By being focused, though, and awestruck. See, yes, there's a tense sense of fear in this passage, but there's also a double edge to it. Yes, the women left with a certain amount of fear, but they also left with a certain amount of awe, and that's different. These words we translate into English sometimes don't do us the greatest justice, because someone's got to figure out what English word we want to put down for this Greek text that we're looking at now so that everybody can read the Gospels in their own language. And so they chose awe or fear, and it alternates depending on the translation. The idea is it's both. It's fear for sure, in all the ways we've already talked about, but it's also awe. It's like, it's amazing that you can't keep, it's like a train wreck, it's like a car wreck, it's like something that is just riveting your attention. And you're not sure what to do with it. By being focused on that feeling, and then running, hurrying into our neighborhoods all around us to share that in tangible ways that can make a difference in people's lives. So we're not talking about kicking up a soapbox on a corner and starting reading from the book of John. We're talking about going out and living like you understand what it means to be in the book of John. That you can feed, that you can clothe, that you can care, that you can demonstrate a sense of something bigger, something greater. Hurrying to meet Jesus in the neighborhoods all around us, that's the sense that comes from the communities who read these stories after they were written. Trimble tells us that's how we build a movement of love and justice, using our buildings, our people, our money in a free-flowing investment to create a just and generous world. That's how we'll rise again. You know, reading these stories over and over again, one might think the women in this gospel would have felt extreme joy at hearing the announcement of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. But Mark says they were frightened. Come to think of it, it's kind of frightening to know we human beings are very, very inadequate in the face of death. It's frightening to realize how finite and mortal we are, how utterly dependent upon God we are. But we are. Which makes it even more frightening, I think, shocking even, when we're faced with the idea of death not being an end, but a new beginning. That, again, is so hard to wrap our minds around. Death is death. I'm still trying to figure out what life's like without my mother around after 94 years. And there are weird things that happen right after somebody you care about for so long has passed. They're not here. And then you say to yourself, what's that like? But they're kind of still here, if you want them to be. And then you have to figure out, what's that like? It's not an end. It's something different. The very first words in Mark's gospel You pick up a Bible and they're in order, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except for they're not in order. Matthew's first, not because it's the oldest book. He's first because he has a birth story in it. So they wanted to have a birth story. So they put Matthew first, but Mark's the oldest. Mark has no birth story. It says in the book, Mark's the shortest. Mark doesn't mess around. Mark says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. That's how Mark begins. And those words aren't meant to, I want you to hear this. They aren't meant to be the beginning of our faith story. They are not. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, is not meant, we, the readers, to be the beginning of our faith story. No, it's the beginning of Mark's story, which was a preamble. You've read books, right? You know they have introductions. Sometimes they have acknowledgments first. Consider the entirety of Mark's gospel to be an introduction. You're being introduced to the whole idea of who this Jesus is and what he's about. It's the backstory before the faith story. The faith story begins with the resurrection and the call to hurry and share a new life, beginning with the neighborhood. Right? Jesus says, come to Galilee, I will meet you there. Come to the neighborhood, Jesus is saying. We're not going to hide in a house. We're not going to hide in a room. We're not going to build a church. We're not going to distance ourselves. You're going to go right back to where it all started. You're going to find me there. That's our Galilee, this neighborhood around us. We shouldn't be afraid to go running out into it. Because that's where Jesus is waiting. You heard this morning the original ending to Mark's gospel. That's how it was originally written. It was shock, it was awe, it was vague. It was a cliffhanger, if you want to use the term we use today with popular fiction and television shows. They finished the season on a cliffhanger. Where's Jesus? What will they do? Tune in next year. That's the original ending. What happens next is up to those who read the story of new life. All the people who read it after it was put into publication in Mark's time, and all of us today. What do? Do we step out and share a new way for a new day, or in our fear, do we play it safe? For us, it's an ending yet to be written. So Mark's gospel says then and now. So what'll it be? Let's pray.